Today I want to talk with you, have a conversation with you about, well, Jesus' favorite subject, money. I find it curious, why did Jesus have so much to say about money? I think the gospel lesson from Luke gives us a bit of a clue. As Luke tells his story of Jesus, he is looking back some 60 years. Luke is a citizen of the Roman Empire. And his audience is more urbane, it is more culturally diverse, it is worldly savvy. And the Christian faith is just beginning to make a few waves across the land, and people are beginning to be curious, what does it mean to be a Christian? And how do these people who wear the Christian label, how do they handle something like, well, for example, money? Luke's Jesus understands the money conundrum. On the one hand, Jesus understands that you and I really can't talk about the issues of everyday life without at the same time talking about money. But Jesus also knows that we cannot talk about money without also inquiring as to what the well-lived life looks like. Jesus gets the money conundrum. An economist friend said to me many years ago, if the Christian church has, in a money economy, if the Christian church has nothing to say about money, chances are it does not have much of importance to say to the world at large. As Jesus sets the stage for our gospel lesson, Jesus is talking to a large crowd. And he's talking about issues of everyday life. He's talking about the importance of telling the truth, the importance of being honest and transparent. But as he looks at his audience, in his audience are people who, well, they use religion as a sham. They take half-truths and they distort reality. They twist the facts, and sometimes they even try to use their faith to lord it over other individuals. Jesus has a word for those kinds of people. He calls them hypocrites or religious play actors. And then he reminds his audience, remember this: what people say in the dark one day will be brought to the light. And what people talk about and gossip about in the alleyways of their homes and the dark corridors will one day be broadcast from the mountaintops. And then Jesus says this, he says, so don't be intimidated by bully talk. Well, in his audience, listening as a young man, to me, he's probably somewhere between his late 20s and early 30s. He's what today we might call a millennial. And as he is listening to Jesus talk about the importance of being honest and truthful, a deep resentment that sits in his soul begins to simmer and reaches a boiling point. You see, his father has recently died, and his brother is trying to defraud him of what the younger brother feels is rightfully his. And before he can begin to even put a muzzle on his emotions, the next thing he hears is himself blurting out loud, Jesus, will you please tell my brother to share what is right with me? Can you taste the silence that slithers through that crowd? It's the money conundrum. How do we get it? What will we do with it? How will we use it? But as you listen to the text, don't miss the uncommon deftness with which Jesus shifts the conversation. He cuts straight to the bottom line, to something that involves everyone in that crowd, the insatiable human desire to have just a little bit more. What is it John D. Rockefeller wrote generations ago? All everyone wants is just $1 more. And then Jesus says this, life is not defined by what you have. You may have a lot, but possessions do not make for a good life. And then Jesus does something that he often does when confronted with a rather prickly question. He stands back, I can see a smile creasing his face. Looking over the audience, he says, let me tell you a story. And he tells the story that was our gospel lesson this morning, the story about an old farmer who at harvest season is blessed with a bumper crop. Suddenly he has more than he ever had before. His abundance leaves him in a quandary. What is he going to do with his more than enough? It's almost as if overnight he's reached that crossover point in life where he has more than he needs. He has enough if he deals with it correctly that's going to take care for him the rest of his life. What does he do? I think he does what most of us would do. Have you ever dreamed, as I have, that someday you're going to win one of these $50 million or $100 million lotteries? What would I do with all that money? I must tell you, sometimes I play that game with my older grandchildren. It's a wonderful way to talk about values. And so the old farmer simply begins to dream. He says to himself, I know what I will do. I will build larger barns. I will reinvest everything. I'll diversify my holdings. I'll secure for myself a happy tomorrow. And that is when it happens. Plump in the middle of his dreaming, God pops up with what is the punchline of the story. God simply says, "You fool. Fool." And what's going to happen to everything when you die? Then Jesus simply concludes, and that's the way it is with those who focus their life on storing up treasures and possessions for themselves, but push God aside, put God on the shelf, are not rich toward God. I ask myself the question, why did Jesus call this farmer a fool? I don't think that Jesus called him a fool because he's a bad person. I don't think that Jesus called him a fool because of what he was planning to do with his money. He wanted a good retirement. I must say that if I had been there, wouldn't we, most of us, want to do something to try to help secure ourselves? I think Jesus called him a fool because he confused the means of life with the ends of life. Suddenly, money became the end game for which he lived. Fools. They confuse money with security, stuff with success, assets with self-worth. The cunning of the money conundrum. There's a fascinating story, short story John Updike tells. The story is called The Wallet. It's the story of a retired stockbroker by the name of Fulham. Fulham is retired, and his life has settled into a rather dull routine. Every morning he potters into his office with the Wall Street Journal on one hand and a cup of decaffeinated coffee in the other. And one morning as he's working in his office, he reaches into his pocket to pull out his wallet, and the wallet isn't there. What in the world has happened to my wallet, he says to himself. He looks on the floor, he pulls out the drawers in his desk, he looks under the cushion where he is seated, he goes into his closet, and he begins to rustle through pockets of pants he hasn't worn for months. Finally, he goes down to breakfast and he announces to his wife, "Darling, something happened last night while you and I were asleep. Someone crept into our house, and you know what they did? They stole my wallet." His wife looks at him. "Fulham," she says, "I've never seen you like this before. You're acting crazy. You're wild." "Wild?" he replies. "But it's my wallet. Without my wallet, I am nothing." I can't answer for you, but I discovered a couple of months ago there's a Fulham in me. My wife and I had taken our youngest granddaughter to the movies. We came home. I was watching the late evening news. And when it was over, I went to the bedroom. I reached into my pocket to put the wallet on the dresser, and my wallet wasn't there. I went back to where I was seated. I looked under the floor. I pulled up the carpet. I went to the closet. I pulled out the coat I had worn that evening. I looked in the pockets. I went into the garage. I went to the car. I looked under every seat. I looked wherever I could. It was after midnight. Finally, I jumped in the car. I drove 5 miles to where the theater was. I somehow found my way in. I went crazy. So crazy that later that night I thought I was having a heart attack, and I ended up literally in the ER unit of the hospital. The pinch of the money conundrum. In his recent book, For the Life of the World, Yale theologian Miroslav Volf makes what I think is an astute observation. He writes that in our modern cultures, it's become quite clear that what we have to do to have a good life is that we must focus on the means. How do we get there? And so Miroslav writes, the upshot is we invest our lives, our time, our energy in securing the resources that we need to find that good life. Important that you have the right degree from the right university. Think about the admission scandals making the headlines this week. You must know the right people. You want to find the right house in the right neighborhood. And then Miroslav writes, when the means of life become the ends for which we live, we humans become like dogs chasing our tails. We simply run around in circles, around and around and around we go as a gnawing kind of emptiness begins to shrivel our souls. The money conundrum. This past fall, there was an essay, it was called The Final Essay, that captured much of social media. It was purported to have been written by Steve Jobs from his deathbed. Didn't prove to be true. But when I read the essay, it was an insightful description of the seductive trap of the money conundrum. It reads in part, I reached the pinnacle of success in the business world. I have all the money that one would ever need, but my wealth is only a fact of life. It has not brought me joy. Material things, they can be found, they can be lost, they can be replaced. But there's one thing that can never be found once you've lost it. And that is life. When the means become the end, we lose our perspective. We lose our balance. We become increasingly spiritually impoverished as God seems ever distant from how we manage the everyday art of living. Wise old John Calvin did not consider money to be evil, but he did consider it to be a temptation. In fact, he had a fascinating phrase he used to describe the money conundrum. He called it, and I quote, a slippery slope. Something that tilts on the one hand to suffocating poverty, and on the other hand it tilts toward self-indulgent materialism. The trick in navigating the slope, Calvin writes, is this, and I quote, to learn to use God's gifts for that end for which they were created, which is for our good and not our ruin. For not only are the gifts of life to provide the necessities of life for us, but they are also to bring us a sense of delight and good cheer. I have to tell you, I find insight in our Presbyterian faith, in our Reformed tradition. Some of you may remember one of the old catechisms. The first question is simply this: what's the chief end for humankind? It's another way of saying, why are we here? How are we supposed to live? Answer: the chief end for which we are to live is to glorify God and enjoy God forever. How does one glorify God? What does it mean to glorify God? As simply as I can put it, I think that to glorify God is to use the gifts that we have in life to put a smile on God's face. Well, what then does it mean to enjoy God forever? To enjoy God forever is to so use whatever we have that it puts a smile on our face, that we understand the joy of living. What's the key? Listening. Listening and paying attention to God, paying attention to our neighbors, paying attention to our city, paying attention to the world in which we live, asking the question, and what might God be about in my neighborhood, where I might do with what has been given to me to put a smile on God's face. Several weeks ago, I was attending my granddaughter's volleyball game. She goes to a Catholic school, and on the walls of the auditorium, the gymnasium, were giant banners calling attention to the 7 virtues of life. It was the banner called Prudence that caught my attention. Underneath was the simple phrase, begin with the end in mind. Begin with the end in mind. Let me tell you a story. Back in 1996, an old washerwoman by the name of Osceola McCarty made the front page of the New York Times. She lived in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and she made the news because she had given a 6-figure gift to the University of Southern Mississippi, which was just down the street from where she lived. And the question was, how in the world did a washerwoman have enough money to make a 6-figure gift to an institution? Well, she had no more than a 6th grade education because she had to leave school in the 6th grade to help her family make a living. Where did she get the money? Every month, she put a little bit from what she earned in a savings account in the bank. She never really bothered to ever look at that savings account, what was happened to it, and now she's almost 86 years of age, and one day the banker looks at her account and discovers that it's a little more than $250,000. So he asked Osceola to come in and visit with him. I learned this story because one of the people with whom I taught at the fundraising school at Indiana University, Gatsby Brown, had once been a news anchor for a station in New York City. And Gatsby told me that when she heard the story, she said, I had to go to Hyattisburg to meet Osceola, and I ended up talking with her banker, and this is what her banker told me. He said, when Osceola came to meet with me, I realized that she probably did not grasp how much money she really had. And so to help her understand it, I took 10 dimes, and I put them on front of the desk where we were sitting, and I said, now, Miss McCarty, just imagine that these 10 dimes represent everything that you have. How would you like to use them? Well, she said, I would like to give 3 to my church. I want to give 2 to my family. The other 5, you know, she said, those folk down the street at the university, they were so good to me. They brought me their washing. They brought me their mending. And she said, you know, because I was a black girl, I could never go there when I was a child. You know what I think I'd like to do? I think I'd like to create a fund that would provide scholarships for black girls like myself because they can now go to that school. Banker looked at her, said, well, that's wonderful, Miss McCarty, but isn't there something you'd like to do for yourself? Oh, no, she said, you know, I'm so happy with what I have. You know, in life, she went on, there's a difference between wants and needs. And I don't need any more than I have. 2 questions freeze themselves on the frame of my mind. I call them take-home questions. Are you using all the resources with which you have been blessed to put a smile on God's face? And when you look at everything that you have, is it a burden to you? Or are you using your resources in such a way to put a smile on your face?